Hello and welcome to the Veeam on Tour ANZ virtual experience. My name's Rick Vanover, Senior Director of Product Strategy here at Veeam, and I'm happy to talk to you about one of my most passionate topics, ransomware. Today, I'm joined by one of the best, Rhys Hammond. How you doing today, Rhys?
I'm doing great, Rick, and it's great to be here and to talk about ransomware. So I'm super excited. Let's get started, shall we?
Yeah, indeed. And tell us about the problem we're trying to fix here, Rhys.
Yeah, so ransomware is a disaster, but it's a disaster that's different from the rest. Firstly, it's on demand. So for as little as $150 US a month, anyone could sign up to ransomware as a service, including you, Rick. So we could start our own criminal business. I don't think I'd recommend it from a professional career-wise perspective, but it's a possibility. And because of that criminal element, we have to work with so many more people. We have to drag in so many more people for the recovery, from legal, forensics, cybersecurity experts, and even certain government departments can get involved in some cases. And on that topic, for instance, the Australian Department of Home Affairs, they've just expanded their legislation, so even more organisations are now required to report cybersecurity incidents, as well as insurance. They treat ransomware differently. So, for example, some policies don't even cover ransomware recovery. So a recent Australian automotive firm was actually caught out by that. So things like forensics, incident response, replacement hardware, all that wasn't covered by their policy. So generally speaking, senior leadership often believe it's a better business decision to simply pay the ransom and hope for the best. The problem with hoping, it's not really a good strategy. So over to you, Rick. Why do we think organisations are having such a tough time?
Well, that's really interesting, Rhys. I mean, I talk to a lot of organizations all over the world. In my time here at Veeam, I've become a little bit of a specialist of sorts with ransomware. And there's a couple of factors. One, each of you watching know that IT environments are more complex and ever-changing than ever. There's also a lot of burden sometimes with recovery. In fact, we have some analyst data indicating that yet still there is a gap in what the business would expect and what the backup implementation can deliver. And when you couple that with the threats of ransomware, this is just exasperating this problem. Now, the good news is each of you are in the right place. Now, we know that disaster recovery takes time. It takes some planning. It takes some resources. But this is the proverbial effort where the juice is worth the squeeze. You can actually get the outcome you want, and we're here to help. But I'd also challenge everyone that it's truly a team effort. And tell me what you're seeing in the market in this regard, Rhys.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So I think first of all, it's a pretty common misconception that recovering from ransomware is actually just handled by the IT department. But because there's so much more, there's the financial, operational, legal, and even reputational challenges. Recovering from ransomware involves so much more than just throwing it to IT and hoping that they can deal with it. It's, as you say, it's also a team effort. So we start with senior leadership. They're the ones that are making the decisions, pulling in more people such as legal and HR, departments which aren't typically involved in the day-to-day security conversations, but they're crucial for ransomware recovery, for successful ransomware recovery. And even public relations, PR, they're going to get involved because making sure customers know what's going on, that's what's going to help save you in the end. Incident responders, they are there to help analyze and drive the recovery. And lastly, but not least, the backup team, they're there to save the day because they've got the backups, but they're not the ones making the decisions about where the backups go or what point in time to use. That's actually the incident responders. So I think we can go to the next slide, which is about why ransomware is so effective. So why is ransomware so effective? Well, if we look at the last 10 years of data from previous ransomware attacks, we can see the top reasons why ransomware can be so successful. Plugging those vulnerabilities is crucial, but remember, it only takes one gap, one hole, one crack for ransomware to grab hold. It's a bit like water. It only takes the smallest crack, the smallest hole in your shingles or the smallest gap in your roof tile, and it finds a way in. It's, the more holes that you have, the more you and your data are going to get wet. And I don't think we want to get wet, do we, Rick? It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So it's interesting to know that with most ransomware attacks, most ransomware attackers, they're looking for quick returns on their time and effort. So the more holes that we can patch, the stronger our fences are that we put up between networks, the more passwords that we securely lock away, the more likely it is for those attackers to actually simply move on to the next house or the next business or the next target, because chances are their windows aren't locked. So, Rick, can you tell us a bit more about this cheeseburger that I keep hearing about? It sounds delicious.
Yeah, well, good point on what you just highlighted there, Rhys. And actually, that is gold advice, and that transcends more than just backup. That's all of IT. But in the end, if something bad happens, we at Veeam firmly believe that you deserve reliable recovery. You need to have the mechanism to get out of this problem. And I would go so far as to say every backup provider in the market would agree, believe it or not, it's the only thing we'd all agree on, is that if ransomware gets in, the only course of action is to recover data. Now, when you look at that multi-tiered response that you were talking about with incident response, cybersecurity teams, legal, HR, all those different areas, in the end, we definitely want our data back. So the Veeam story, and this is also where we're going to end it, is that secure backup is your last line of defense. So we're going to walk you through trusted immutability, backup verification, the 32110 rule, instant recovery at scale, secure restore, and DR orchestration. These are the basics that will make all the difference in the world. And it starts on the left, on the backup section. This is that these are the steps you need to take now to make the recovery section on the right make sense to you later. Sound like a plan, Rhys? All right, let's jump into it. Now, one of my secret weapons. Now, Rhys has known me for a long time, and a couple of you here on the stream as well. I've been at Veeam for a while. I'm based in the Veeam Central Ohio office, and that's where one of our support centers are based. I love talking to this group. There's a special department called the SWAT team, which stands for somewhat above a tier. All they do is handle ransomware cases, and I love their information. Now, the good news, Rhys, is that their advice is not changing a lot, which means what I am telling the market is actually good and working. And it sounds a little bit morbid, Rhys, but I pay a lot more attention listening to what is not working. Tell me about things that did not end in a successful outcome. I want to flip that around and take it to the market. Number one thing, for 2.5 years when I've been talking to, or actually 3 years that I've been talking to them about this, is that there's not an ultra resilient copy, and we'll get to what that means here in a second, and organizations aren't following that 321 rule. Make no mistake, if you do not have a copy of your data that is in some form of an ultra resilient mechanism, you are really walking into the number one reason why some organizations don't have a successful outcome. So we'll get to how you do that in a second. But hopefully immutable, offline, air-gapped, hardened, those are things that ring a bell for you. Number 2 on the list is actually kind of a surprising one. And imagine you've done everything right, you've got your immutable backups in place, and you've encrypted them with your own password, but you've lost that password. That is an unfortunate situation. If you have backup data in a bucket, say in an immutable offsite resource, if you don't have the password that you encrypted it with, we won't be able to drive that recovery. So manage those passwords for anything going outside of your organization well. Very important. The number 3 thing that we see is kind of the opposite of a hardening experience, is using one account for everything. So a ransomware infection loves to, expose and reuse account with a lot of privileges. So make sure we're not using the same account for both source data and target data. Explicit minimal permissions, these are things we're supposed to be doing anyways. These are the top 3, and I'm going to come back to some more that kind of fit the storyline here from our support team. But I think, Rhys, we need to have some flexibility, and how Veeam goes into the market makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely, Rick. So as we all know, Veeam is created to be as flexible as possible. You're in control of things like storage, what storage you choose, what storage you pick, what storage you want to provision on, and the configuration of how Veeam is going to use that storage. And that same thing applies to networking and everything else, meaning you can fit Veeam into your existing environment without having to re-architect your environment to fit Veeam. That's the way it should be, right? And so we can deploy Veeam in any which way we choose, but there's still a couple best practices that we recommend that you follow to get the best outcome, to have the best solution. And one recent example that I've seen from the field is around the Veeam hardened repository. And we usually recommend, and we always recommend, to use a dedicated physical server. But I've seen Veeam hardened repositories that aren't deployed on a physical server. It was deployed on a virtual machine. I thought, whoa, that's not the best practice. That's usually not what we recommend. But deploying the hardened repository for that customer in that instance, that was actually the best design for their environment. And a bit of background on why we don't usually recommend virtual machines for a hardened repository. It's to stop someone from simply deleting that VM along with all its virtual machine disks. Poof. There goes your immutable backup files along with the VM. But for this particular customer, their backup disks were mounted using something called an iSCSI initiator within the guest OS. So VMware didn't have any control or insight or management over those backup disks. So that meant they had immutable VM backup files plus the benefit that virtualization brings without any concern of an attacker having access to VMware and deleting those VM backup files. Granted, this solution does have some extra caveats, like we're relying on locking down that back-end iSCSI storage. But imagine the benefits of combining a storage snapshot with something like a 3-day retention lock at the storage layer, combining that with 14 days of immutable VM backups. That's a powerful combination, right? And in saying all this, yes, our best practice is still to use a physical server for the hardened repository. But it just goes to show, Rick, how flexible Veeam can be.
Yeah, I have seen some things in my time here at Veeam, right? And that is one of those configurations that actually could be quite attractive for some people, especially if you think about they also have a copy, say, in an S3 bucket in the cloud. And so now I want to show you something here that is kind of one way to view this. And a lot of times when I talk to customers and partners all over the world, if I don't know much about their deployment or their environment or what they've done so far, this is actually my starting point, Rhys, right? So let's take something like this, which is a trusted immutability deployment, where on the left here, the performance tier, which is an element, an extent of the scale-out backup repository, we have that Veeam hardened repository. And it could be just like you described, right? A nice SCSI target. If I had a blank check and an open recommendation, it would be to make it a physical server with dedicated direct attached storage. But as you say, some organizations don't do that. Or maybe look at it this way, where they have a copy, say, in the capacity tier, which is an S3 compatible, or even the public AWS S3. And by the way, there are 21 different S3 compatible Veeam ready object with immutability qualified partners. That might be an acceptable trade-off where you have both copies here. This is what I call double play immutability, where you have two copies, one off-site, one on-site. Both of them are fully recoverable. Both of them are immutable with two different control planes, and neither of them have a persistent connection back to the Veeam server. I think it's a rather resilient specimen, but as we were preparing, Rhys, he said, well, maybe not everyone's ready for Linux, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that haven't moved from a Windows repository to a Veeam hardened repository on Linux yet, because remember, Veeam is flexible and it gives us choices, there's still some steps that we can take to lock down that Windows OS just to harden it, Rick. So remember, we're still not going to make those backup files on the Windows OS acting as a repository. We're not going to make them immutable, but we're doing something that's going to help reduce that attack surface that ransomware tries so hard to get a hold of. But let me circle back. Veeam hardened repository in Linux, it's still our recommendation. It's still a much better choice. but there's still things that we can do for customers and end users that aren't quite ready for that Linux hardened repository on premises or for that local backup, to make it that little bit harder for ransomware to target that backup data that's on that Windows OS. And anything that makes it harder for ransomware attackers is a good thing in my books. So yeah, if you're not using Linux hardened repositories just yet, lock down your Windows OS. Make sure RDP is turned off. Make sure it's not joined to the main production domain. All these couple of things that we can do, all these things that we can do to harden that Windows OS. And there's a really great Veeam best practices guide available that can actually take you through those 6 or 7 steps, which unfortunately I don't have the time to go through right now just yet. But I highly recommend that Veeam best practices Windows OS hardening guide that's available on the Veeam best practices website. So I think our next slide is about 3210, Rick, or is it, what's next?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's that or just a different view of this double play, right? I got to give a shout out, Rhys, to our Veeam Cloud service providers. Veeam Cloud Connect with Insider Protection is actually an interesting specimen as well. It has immutability, say with the hardened repository, and then a second copy in a service provider cloud. But one thing's really special here, Rhys. We provide 4 eyes recovery, right? So this is yet another way of achieving the outcome of an ultra resilient copy, immutable offline air gap, 4 eyes recovery. This is just another way. Not every architecture fits every customer view. And that's just exactly why the 3-2-1 rule is so versatile. And I'm sure it comes up in every partner and customer conversation you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And just circling back, I love it when customers have that double or even triple play immutability. It's kind of like a bingo card. The more they can put that stamp down, the happier I am, and the less likely ransomware attackers are likely to lead to an unsuccessful outcome or an unsuccessful restore, the more that we can make sure that immutability and offside is in play. So 3-2-1, so modern malware, yeah, it is quite known to attack that backup layer. It's going for the backups because that's where some of your most valuable data is. It's how we restore. And it's important to have something in place to combat this. And that's where this golden rule of 3-2-1 comes in. Now, let's just say this 3-2-1 rule says there needs to be 3 copies of your important data on at least 2 different media, and one of those needs to be off-site. But as this threat of ransomware has evolved and changed, we've actually expanded this rule by adding an extra 1 and an extra 0 onto the end. The extra 1 meaning that we have at least 1 copy of your data that is resilient, either through being air-gapped, offline, or immutable. And then we also have the extra 0 meaning automated backup verification, which helps ensure your data is valid and usable. Because let's be honest, you can't recover data that hasn't been captured correctly in the first place. It's sort of like garbage in, garbage out kind of methodology. And remember, there's lots of different ways to achieve these backup rules. Remember how I mentioned earlier that Veeam is flexible, so there's plenty of ways you can get this 3-2-1 best practice in play quite quickly. Rick, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, just that, this doesn't require any specific hardware either. This doesn't imply that you have to use the cloud. You can do this all on-prem on your own kit, So the flexibility is so real, and kind of a new element that we're adding here is really breaking down what those offline air-gapped and immutable options are with Veeam. And again, talk to your partner, talk to your Veeam rep and your staff here at the event. They're happy to talk to you about this. But, the Veeam Ready object with immutability qualification is a great list to start with. Like I said, there's 21 providers there. Veeam Cloud Connect with Insider Protection, again, similar outcome, but a little bit more versatile in that you can actually recover to an IaaS platform right from that service provider. We talked about the Veeam hardened repository. Tape has still got some credibility here, especially if you remove it from the library, and if you have the worm media option where it's basically write once, read many tape media. In fact, if you remove that from the library, that is offline, air-gapped, and immutable all at once. That's pretty powerful. A couple of our storage partners have a few mechanisms that can address this with worm storage snapshots as well. anything that requires 4 eyes recovery. And that sometimes gets into a combination of things. For example, Cloud Connect with Insider Protection requires 4 eyes recovery. A Pure Storage Safe Mode Snapshot or an ExaGrid Retention Time Lock has to be pulled out with 4 eyes as well. And the only caution that I would have is any type of replica or storage snap that isn't really worm and it isn't using a 4 eyes recovery model. But this is the menu. And I think that, actually when you look at it this way, there's a lot of options here. All right, so I'm going to go back to my support information sources, and actually testing restores is actually very important. Whether it's Sure Backup, the automated recovery verification technique that, Rhys, did you know it's almost 12 years that it's been in market? So I think people are out of excuses. Yeah. But, the takeaway here is that during a ransomware recovery, chances are you're going to egress a lot of data from what you've backed up. And that's not the time to find out about bit rot or low-level corruption. Or, even just on a people standpoint, you just don't know how to do a massive recovery, right? So at a minimum, be familiar with it and then go to those next level things of 3-2-1 rule and using a Sure Backup technique. And this is actually an interesting thing that's the support team tells me people are doing. And that's making a recovery room or a clean site to drive recovery. It can be as simple as a Veeam console with all the passwords remembered. Remember the situation of forgetting the encryption password. But that console is always turned off unless it needs to be updated or manage a password change. That is like a resource that you can use to drive recoveries. That's like a DIY kind of jump box to drive recoveries. We're seeing a lot of people do that. There's no additional Veeam cost for that, so that's pretty attractive as well. Now, these are the pieces of advice, but I think also detection is actually really important as well. And what are you seeing in the market about detection, Rhys?
Yeah, Rick. So I'll just start with saying that it is so crucial to detect signs of ransomware as early as possible, because you really don't want to be finding that ransomware from a help desk ticket or a message from your boss saying at 11 o'clock at night saying, hey, I've got this Bitcoin, I need to pay half a Bitcoin to get this PDF open. What is it? How do I pay? That's not a good position to be in. So Veeam 1 can actually help us get there with monitoring your environment and generating alerts so we can detect that ransomware attack before your boss sends you that text message late at night. And the first report that we can recommend to start off with is that possible ransomware activity alarm. It's one that can track those indirect signs of ransomware. It looks at things like the CPU, the data store write rate, and how much network is being consumed, which can all point to signs of encryption as it's happening. And secondly, the other report we can recommend is the suspicious incremental backup report, which looks at the size of recently created backups with earlier backups or the most recent backups, and it does like a bit of a difference comparison. And if there's any significant size, any difference in the size of those backups, as in the case when you might be having files encrypted on that VM, that's going to blow out the backup size, so that alarm can actually pick that up to say, hey, there's a lot of changes on this virtual machine disk. The backup is much larger than it usually is to try and encapsulate or capture those changes. Let's trigger an alarm to say that's a bit suspicious. So there are 2 alarms that we can use straight away in Veeam that are built in, which are fantastic for that ransomware detection, to detect signs of ransomware. But another quick tip is, with the beauty of Veeam 1 is we can actually take this step a bit further and start performing remediation actions if these alarms are triggered. So for one, we can disconnect the virtual machine from the network or take a snapshot of that virtual machine if the alarm's triggered. And that's great because it gives you choices. We can take quite a step that's going to be quite aggressive and take that virtual machine off the network completely. That's going to have some impact to your production machines. And if you're not quite ready to go that drastic step, why don't we create a storage snapshot of that virtual machine so we can try and get that point in time recovery as soon as we understand there might be some ransomware going on, without the risk of dropping your clients or dropping your users off that database or off that application. Another quick tip sort of from the field that I like to recommend a lot is the unprotected VM report, Rick. And the reason why is so we can detect a virtual machine that was accidentally or even intentionally removed from a backup job. Because you might not notice that virtual machine missing from the job immediately, especially if you're only looking for those green ticks to say, hey, did the job complete or not? So run that report daily. You'll get a notification, like a daily report to say what VM should have been protected and it hasn't. So that's a really good report to be running. And if you want to know more, I believe there is a QR code at the end of this slide deck, there it is, to have a bit of an overview of the Veeam 1 capabilities. So I think we can move on to data mobility now, Rick.
Yeah, so I wrote that post about what Veeam 1 can do regarding to ransomware, because to be fair, Rhys, Veeam 1 will tell you a lot about your environment very quickly. So if you're really concerned about ransomware, I think it's like 6 or 8 different things here that we talked about here, and I'm going to update it by that recommendation you just made. But you can go to that QR code at the Veeam Community Hub to read that up. But when problems strike, sometimes we need to move stuff around. Tell me about some of the things you're seeing in market for that.
Yeah, so true portability that Veeam provides is such a big advantage for opening up recovery options. And with Veeam, we can copy backups to wherever we need them without locking you down. So restoring from backups is about being just as flexible. And this is important for ransomware recovery because you might not be able to restore your data back to the same place it came from. So an example of this would be, say, during a ransomware attack, it's possible that your data center becomes evidence. It's locked away behind virtual police tape, and in some circumstances, literally physical police tape. So let's imagine your physical server's encrypted and it's going to take multiple days for forensics to do their thing to complete their analysis. Now, what are you going to do in the meantime? Do you go out and buy a new server? I think everyone can agree with recent times with COVID, it's quite difficult to procure new hardware, especially with long lead times. So what do? Well, with Veeam, we could restore that backup of that physical server pretty much anywhere. We could restore it to a virtual machine. We could restore it to the cloud. We could restore it anywhere. We've got so much more flexibility. So this means that we can get back from a ransomware attack to normal operations so much faster, even while the ransomware investigation of the encrypted data is still happening with minimal fuss. And this data mobility, it helps flip that decision that senior leadership need to make when recovering from a ransomware attack. So just remember, if you want to make it we want to make it a better choice to recover from backups instead of paying that ransom. And one last thing that's super important to mention, Rick, is we actually don't need the Veeam infrastructure to recover our backups. We can leave behind that Veeam backup server with just our backup files. Remember that they're truly portable and the mobility they provide, and we can recover just fine, really anywhere that we need to. Over to you, Rick.
Rhys, you bring up a very good point. Veeam backups do not require any prior knowledge of the infrastructure. In fact, one of my favorite things to do every year is the Veeam entry for the Magic Quadrant. And they're always asking about, describe your media server and your catalog server. And I'm like, we don't have that component. We simply don't, because the backups are fully self-describing and portable. No prior infrastructure knowledge. That's very, very valuable nowadays. So let's continue on with the advice from our support team. So one of their also most persistent advices, and this matches your hardening advice, Rhys, is use MFA wherever possible. Now, we've probably had it in the plenary session. Good news, MFA is coming in Veeam Backup and Replication V12 for the application level, right? So, but if you think about even just the key components, you might want to put MFA there as well. This is something that the burden to do that is worth the outcome, so highly recommend that. One of the last pieces of advice is actually pretty interesting for organizations who use tape. The thought is that, I've got tape, I'm totally safe, right? I don't have to do anything. Well, if you don't take it out of the library that's potentially a new problem, right? So we've seen scenarios where some people haven't taken it out of the library. Maybe they haven't been going into the data center, working from home, things like that. That's the type of thing that you might want to make sure that we're doing today, right? So, or use worm media. So if it's not operationally getting taken out, we might want to make sure that it is taken care of that way. And then the last piece of advice is simply a people problem, not knowing where to start. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes I see organizations who haven't really given thought to the response plan. Now, here in the United States, where I do most of my partner and customer work, I would say that cities and states and governments, they actually have a better handle on that, because in schools as well, because they have predefined incident response processes. But if you don't have that, that's something you need to think about. Now, do any of these stick out to you, Rhys, as something that might be attractive and good practical field advice?
Yeah, that MFA piece is exceptional. It's one of the things I've been looking forward to the most, because previously when I was working for a partner doing Veeam installations and design, we would always recommend, hey, install MFA on the operating system of the backup server and certainly the backup repository. So we do things like install Cisco Duo, and whenever someone would log into that backup server or the backup jump box, because ideally we don't want everyone to RDP straight to the backup server. Let's use the jump box. We'll throw Cisco Duo on that to get MFA. So anytime someone would RDP, they'll get that two-factor authentication prompt. Hey, do you accept or do you deny? Click OK, you can log in. And one thing I wanted to point out is even with this version 12 enhancement with MFA on the console, I'd probably still recommend, Rick, I don't know about you, but I would probably personally still recommend that we still throw that MFA on the operating system as well, just for that double play MFA. And one last thing I will mention about MFA is just like your backup encryption passwords, don't lose your MFA recovery passwords, please, those recovery codes, because that's something that also is going to be perhaps important during a disaster recovery event where you might not have your phone or you might not have that MFA token. So you need that recovery code to sort of still get access. And if you've lost that, just like your encryption password, that could make things a whole lot more challenging to a successful restore during a DR.
Love that. Double play MFA, because this is actually a mindset that our product managers have. And the thought is if a threat actor is on a system or on a network with enough time, they'll eventually do something wrong. So another layer that you could put in is just MFA to that resource that then has MFA to that application. Love that. Good stuff. But like when it all comes down, Rhys, to the end, how do we have to be ready to handle this problem?
Yeah, so to be ready for this, the challenge of recovery, first of all, we have to make sure you understand your RTOs, your restore time objectives. And importantly, know how long it's going to take to actually to do that restore. It's one thing to know what you're hoping for or what your requirements are, but how does that marry up to reality? And Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, that's a great tool for that. That allows you to test what your RTOs you can actually achieve. Additionally, Veeam 1 and its alarms and reports, it can find problems both at the source and the backup. So it's important to make sure that, hey, is our environment ready for recovery? And Veeam 1 can help with that. And think about what happens after the restore. Do you have enough backup storage to keep protecting those encrypted virtual machines? Because do we stop backing them up once it's encrypted? I'd probably recommend we just keep that backup going just in case. But now we also have to back up the restored VMs as well. Do you have enough backup capacity for that? But not to worry, if you don't, we could always extend or tier out to cloud object storage. Also ask questions like, do you have enough resources to power on those restored VMs? Do you have enough compute, CPU, memory to actually power those on while forensics are still dealing with those encrypted VMs as evidence? We now have to power on that same VM but twice. Have a plan B. So if Steve from legal can't make it into the ransom recovery because he's sick, consider that bus factor. Plan for the worst. If Steve misses his bus, or heaven forbid, he gets hit by the bus, what's plan B? What do you do? So make sure you have that plan for the worst, hope for the best. And a quick tip, I don't think we've mentioned it yet, but Secure Restore, it's a fantastic Veeam feature that allows you to leverage your antivirus software to scan backups before restoring back to production. But quick tip, set up that antivirus software before the ransomware attack, because it just reduces your time to start that successful restore if you don't have to worry about installing the AV. Where do I get the download from? Where's the license for that AV client? Set it up in advance. But yes, guys, the best practice for recovering from ransomware attacks is still to restore from backups. When your data is encrypted, what else are you going to do? So document, practice, role play it, make sure people know how to find the plan. Don't just have it in your head, make sure everyone's aware of it, and make sure it's written down in multiple locations. And please don't make the assumption that just everyone knows how things will work. During an actual disaster, that's the worst time to say, I think it works this way, or I hope it works this way, because as we both know, hope isn't a very good strategy. The confidence in your ability to recover, again, that helps sway that decision for senior leadership to not pay the ransom. So yeah, that's my take on how to be ready for recovery, Rick.
Yeah, you hit on so many good points there, Rhys. Couple points I'll add. I definitely recommend being familiar with the secure restore process. It's part of the image-based recoveries. Go through it one time, even if you're not at an incident. Do like Rhys says, make sure it knows about the antivirus. You can customize it, get an expectation of the time it takes, etc. And then secondly, on the people, let's not pick on Steve from legal this time, but I will say I've debriefed a lot of ransomware situations, Rhys, where just determining who's in charge or what are we going to do from a people standpoint to answer that question, I've seen organizations take days to do that, and that is unacceptable. The good news is there's a lot of capabilities that we can use right now. So, I've got a story for every neighborhood on this chart, Rhys, but a lot of people don't know that there are 91 ways to drive data recovery with Veeam backup and replication. It's so powerful. And again, many of these don't require any specific infrastructure. Many of these can go to new platforms like to the cloud, or to Hyper-V, or to another hypervisor. One thing I want to highlight is kind of an anecdotal story is down in the bottom right. It says Explorer for storage snapshots. So let me tell you a story, Rhys, about there was a healthcare provider in the States here. And I was debriefed of a support case, a ransomware case that they had. And it was breaking all of the rules we had up front, which was not doing the 3-2-1 rule. They had one singular copy of the backup data. They were using the same account for everything. And to be fair, this was before the Veeam hardened repository existed. And our support team has tricks. Our support team has checkdowns. They have all kinds of things. But I'm summarizing the process. But it was like, do you have a copy in the cloud? No. Did you have anything on another different media? No. Did you have any other copies? No. Every question, no. And the production data was tanked, as was the backup data. And then kind of that last gasp of effort was, okay, what are you using for primary storage? And the story was told to me of the phone getting muffled into the shirt and say, hey, what's the primary storage? And somebody said Nimble or something like that, or some brand that we have an integration with. And then our support tech was like, oh, well, are you using the storage integration? And then the customer said, what's that? And we're like, wow, okay. So then they found out that the consultant or the vendor who set it up actually had this default snapshot window of 1 week. Every 4 hours, a storage snapshot was taken. And to your point, with no prior knowledge of the infrastructure, a new Veeam server was deployed. It connected to that storage array, and it drove instant VM recovery from storage snapshots from a time before the threat hit, and they had no data loss. But that's luck. that's random, and that is not something you want to try to build into your recovery. But, again, having just these other types of recoveries for ransomware can really help. And by the way, instant recovery from a storage snapshot is actually really fast, right? And then you name it. Each one of these can have a good example, but I think that's a really powerful example. Now,
so Rick, I'll just quickly add on that 91 recovery methods.
Yeah.
What I would love to do when I was delivering Veeam for customers was actually print this out on the biggest piece of paper I could get my hands on, whether it was A3 or larger. And usually during the handover or the skills transfer at the end of that Veeam deployment, I'll get this big piece of paper that's rolled up and give it to the customer and say, here, stick this on the wall. And we would spend, no joke, at least an hour just looking at each one of these recovery options and saying, oh, okay, well, what does that look like in the Veeam console? Where's that? And I didn't realize how simple that was. And most of the time, like they could not have imagined 90% of these recovery options. That most people would just think we can recover a VM, a disk, and maybe a file or two, let alone like another 85 recovery options. So every time I see this poster, this 91 recovery scenarios, and every time we release a new version and it grows, it's just awesome to see. Because I think version 10, the number was a little bit smaller, and we just keep growing and growing and growing. Eventually we'll hit that magic 100 number, I'm sure, in no time.
There we go. I think this was my idea, by the way. I did this, I want to say, in the 6.5 era, and I'm going long on my memory. I think it was 36. And how far we've come. Actually, it might have been before. Actually, it was when we had the first Explorer, which was either 6.5 or 6.1. That's when I got this idea, because it just started ramping up. But as we wrap up here, we're actually going to end right where we started. This is our story, that secure backup is the last line of defense. And this is across our product set, and there's different capabilities across the different types of workloads you're going to protect. But the reality is, in the backup section, trusted immutability, recovery verification, the 32110 rule, those are the steps that need to happen and need to happen now. Because by the numbers, the type of disaster you're most likely going to deal with is a ransomware incident compared to things like fire, flood, and blood. So having the ability to do instant recovery, which also is nearly 12 years old now, and secure, restore, and orchestrated recoveries, these are the outcomes you need to have today. What we've seen here at Veeam is just an explosive growth in the threatscape, but in the end, the steady state advice of what we're saying here is going to get you through this problem. We've done a number of different pieces of research in the market, but, Rhys, when you talk to customers about how do I get started or how do I convince the boss, what's a great resource to get started with?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ransomware Trends Report is basically the one-stop shop for ways to justify your investment into cybersecurity. Because remember, the reality is most organizations throw a lot of money at this cybersecurity after an event has happened. And the problem is some organizations might not survive a ransomware attack. So this report contains a lot of useful information and data that will hopefully make that justification into ransomware readiness and ransomware defense without having to go through that same heartache and risking the business, the organization. It is available for download via the short link at the bottom of the slide, but otherwise a quick sip of Google search for the ransomware report, Veeam ransomware report will bring it up. So Rick, can you share with us some more ransomware resources?
Yeah, I will in just a second, but a very important caveat. The over 1,000 respondents who explained their experience of being, their journey of being attacked by ransomware, they are not Veeam customers. This is raw market data. So you might read this report and be like, oh my gosh, this is bad. It is bad. But you're in the right place. We have the tools to help. But I should really have an important caveat that these are just non-biased respondents from the market. But when you want to go deep and wide with the Veeam capabilities, these 3 links on the right can help you get there. Now, we forgot to mention this at the beginning, but right here on the left, this QR code will download a PDF for this slide deck. So you can have all the links and these pieces of information at the ready, share it with your peers, ask Rhys and I a question on Twitter, or if you see us at the event or such. we're here to help. But we also have 3 really good pieces of advice I want to highlight. One is the hardened repository white paper. So not everyone's ready for Linux, but we have a nice white paper that can get you there if you're ready to go there. The middle point, the service provider lookup, incredible options for service providers in ANZ. I know, Rhys, you have some experience in that space as well. And then a white paper on secure backup. So anything you want to add as we wrap up, Rhys?
No, Rick, I think you've basically captured everything, and there's nothing really more that I can share. One last thing I will mention is check out the community forums and the R&D forums over at Veeam. There's lots of great information being shared on there as well, tips and useful guides from the community, which I found really useful over the time when I was configuring and deploying Veeam. So that's definitely another resource I would recommend.
Yeah. So forums.veeam.com, community.veeam.com. It all starts at veeam.com. That's all you need to know. All right, Rhys. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me here on this virtual session.
My pleasure. And thank you, Rick. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoy the rest of your virtual Veeam Forum ANZ experience, and we'll see you in the next session.